Buenas tardes, Matthew Collins. Es un placer para nosotros, para la Marea, estar charlando contigo después del aterrizaje de la serie Walking, que se está estrenando estas semanas en Filming y que ya está empezando a dar mucho que hablar. Y la verdad es que ha sido una sorpresa descubrir que ya nos conocíamos y haber retomado este contacto para poder hablar no solo de la serie, sino de toda tu trayectoria y de todo tu trabajo. ¿Quién fue antes Matthew Collins y quién es ahora Matthew Collins?
Well, I'm a lot older than I look. During the 1980s, I was a far-right activist in fascist and neo-Nazi organizations in London. And after a particularly violent incident, one of many violent incidents, which is portrayed in the walk-in, I decided, or I had an epiphany that I was on the wrong side, that I could not keep doing the sort of things that we were engaged in. And I went to anti-fascists because we were obviously aware that they spied and monitored us. And I said, I want to work with you now. I want to stop this. I want to combat this. I was 19 at the time. And then at 21, I fled the UK to Australia because I was caught. And then I spent 10 years in Australia and I came back and I took up the role of recruiting and running spies inside the far right for the organization Hope Not Hate. I am described as a researcher. I'm the head of intelligence. Um, I do a lot of television, radio, and I'm also an author. So it's been 51 now. So it's been an exciting life.
I'm sure. No fue cosa de un día, a pesar de que hubo varios hechos que te hicieron reflexionar, sino que imagino que fue un proceso, el ir dándose cuenta poco a poco del lugar donde estabas y lo que estabas haciendo.
Yeah, I mean, in all and in total, I was involved. I was employed. I had a full-time job with the far right for 6 years. And so I saw upfront and personal how these organizations are run and how these organizations think. And I became disillusioned. I think that's the fair thing to say. I became very disillusioned with the sort of cynicism behind the leadership of these organizations. And also, I think partly as well, I was also very, very young. And I think getting involved in the far right was my way of trying to make a quite unextraordinary life. I lived in social housing in southeast London. My parents had split and divorced when I was 5, and it seemed to me to be a way, the racism, the hatred, and the violence. It seemed to me to be a way of finding a cultural identity, finding something to believe in, finding something to have. And I was very, very puritanical. And then they offered me a job, and I was working for them full time. And I realized that it first of all, it doesn't work. It's never going to work, what it is that these people want. And secondly, I've always been very conscious. I'm working class. I have Irish parents. I lived in social housing, and the things that I was attracted to had alternatives. There were alternative answers. There were better ways to redress my poverty, my lack of education, my lack of social standing, and having first chosen this idea that I can just use violence against others and to improve my social standing. It doesn't, it doesn't improve my life, and it doesn't improve the life of others. So I very, very simply, I just grew up.
Yeah.
I just grew up, and you have to the 1980s, the far right in the United Kingdom was tiny. There was less than 1,000 people involved in it. So obviously, I, I had quite a big identity. I was very, very well known. And for me to, having attained all this, for me to suddenly change my mind and turn against it, although that was a secret for a long period of time, was quite a real shift, a real change in my life, in the way that I lived. And I quit the job that they gave me, but I became physically sick. I think that's the best way to describe it. Physically sickened by them, and I guess unbeknown then that I would now, more than 30 years on, still be, I hope, still be every day making their lives a misery.
A pesar de el perfil de mucha de la gente que se acerca y que milita en la extrema derecha, de ser personas que buscan una identidad con un entorno desestructurado muchas veces, hay gente muy inteligente que también está detrás, sobre todo al mando de estos grupos de extrema derecha. Por eso, desterrar también un poco el cliché de que el fascismo, la gente que milita en grupos nazis, son ignorantes.
Absolutely, it's not ignorance. I mean, the far right has changed quite dramatically in this country now, but some of the people who were leading lights in the far right in the late 70s up until the late 80s and early 90s were Oxbridge educated. They'd been to places like Cambridge and Oxford. They came from very, very wealthy families. And these were often the people that were most extreme. And I guess because they had old money behind them, they had this, they felt entitled to push these young working class lads to be more extreme and more violent. And I think I've always said about some of the characters that I met, the early leaders, almost all of whom are dead now, was that if you were to meet them, you would think that they were extremely well-read people, but they read the wrong sort of books. And we say intelligent. I'd probably say they were more clever. And in later life, you go behind their personal stories, and behind all of them, there's a deep sense of sadness, or there's a sense of failure. That although they sort of impose a political and social will over others, this is going back to these people in the past, almost all of them have a personal tragedy or deep sadness or a failure behind them. Most of them had fallen out of the Conservative Party or had been attached in some way to mainstream political parties, and then somehow bumped or grinded their way down, or they were the least favorite child. It's quite, it's quite extraordinary. There's a really, really good book about it. But almost all, as with all politicians, but you tend to find that the people who lead small but extreme political parties are quite grandiose, are set themselves up as being from, particularly with fascists, from a different and better class of society. And this is your chance to sniff how the good half live. And then when you look behind them, they're just full of sadness and bitterness and emptiness, because they've actually failed at something they do, something that they did. And then to a man, that's what I found. Of all of the leaders I came into contact with, of all the people that stood on marches and demonstrations saying, get into them, go and get stuck in, you find that behind all of them, they're really quite shallow, quite empty characters.
Decidiste no solo abandonar, sino comprometerte con la lucha contra estos grupos, contra el discurso de odio, y colaborando con organizaciones como Hope Not Hate. ¿Por qué? ¿Y a qué se dedica Hope Not Hate?
I mean, I was one of the founding members of Hope Not Hate. In fact, initially, Hope Not Hate was a tiny, small group of anti-fascists and trade unionists, and now it's one of the biggest anti-fascist organizations in Europe, the biggest anti-fascist organization in the UK, and it's changed very much. I think traditional anti-fascism, when Hope Not Hate was launched, we made a conscious decision that there are issues on which progressives can never argue. There are issues on which people shy away from tackling. And with sometimes when awful and terrible things happen, we leave a whole vacuum for the far right to fill because there's just some things we can't talk about. And we realized that it was about upskilling people, dedicated anti-fascists who don't like fascists, but sometimes may struggle how to put a progressive spin or find a progressive answer in some of the terrible things that happen. And one of the many things was we had a really, and we have an ongoing grooming scandal in the United Kingdom, and in some towns and cities, 2,500 girls in a small town like Rotherham in Yorkshire were groomed and raped, and the local council, local politicians, and the local police force, it's actually on record, didn't want to do anything about it because they were scared of being called racists. Now, we're anti-fascists, and the people who were groomed and abused and raped were working class white girls by predominantly, but not exclusively, Asian males. And we said we have to be grown up and big enough as anti-fascists to say there's a number of issues here, one of which is the way working class girls are treated. A lot of them were in care. So why should we hide away from this? We condemn grooming. We condemn raping young girls. We condemn all of these things. And some people, that was when Hope Not Hate really broke through. Some people were so shocked by this that we spoke out on something, but we clawed back the moral high ground. I'm a father, other fathers and mothers and uncles and aunties and grandparents. And we clawed back that moral high ground. And it's about how do we fill these vacuums where the far right? And so one of the things that Hope Not Hate's done, it's our 20th anniversary next year, is we've given hope to the labour movement and trade unionists and anti-fascists that we don't hide from these things. When you get racist and far right characters on television pointing fingers, we either take it on the chin, and you can take it on the chin because things happen in society that aren't pleasant, but also we think we can empower people to fight back, that actually we do have answers for difficult questions. And we do believe in community, and we do believe in a strong and civilized society. And we change the way that anti-fascists think, that we cannot ignore what it is the far right are successful on. Sometimes it puts us in difficult situations or difficult positions, but if you're here for the long run, then those are the stages. There's nothing we'll hide from. There's nothing we have to hide from, and it's about confidence. And being proud of being anti-fascist means also that you're not anti everything. We believe in things. We believe in community. We believe in society. We have to stand up for those things, and we have to sometimes take unpopular positions, but also take, without sounding too moralistic, but I come back to that thing about we want to live in a civilized society. So uncivil behavior, antisocial behavior must be tackled, must be condemned, so that we can have that level playing field for everybody.
En España, a pesar de la larga tradición de la lucha antifascista desde la Guerra Civil y después durante la dictadura, sigue existiendo todavía cierto estigma hacia la palabra antifascista, ¿no? Y se presenta demasiadas veces en los medios de comunicación casi como una tribu urbana. ¿Pasa lo mismo en el Reino Unido?
Yeah, it's I think first of all, look, I was inspired by the Spanish anti-fascists. I was inspired by the international brigades. I went to Barcelona when they handed Spanish citizenship to former members of the members of the brigades. I was absolutely inspired by that story. I think what made it particularly difficult was Donald Trump describing Antifa
Yeah.
as a terror organization. It's mildly amusing because the great Winston Churchill, despite all of his faults, was of course an anti-fascist. Roosevelt was an anti-fascist, and it's funny. People say things like, "Oh no, not Antifa." So Donald Trump's ignorance and stupidity doesn't help. But no, I think because we have a strong tie-in with the trade union movement, and at the moment in our country, the trade unions are heavily engaged in wage struggles to try and lift people's standard of living. People are beginning to show again faith in trade unions, and anti-fascism as a core runs through trade unions. But people besmirch anti-fascists and they say that we all wear black face masks, but that it's just not understanding what anti-fascism is. The What has happened, and I'm sure it's the same in Spain, is the rise in conspiracy theory, is the rise in the idea about freedom of speech and all these sort of things, is that people seem to think there's no place for anti-fascism in modern society because just about everyone, look at our government at the moment, seems to either be fascist or fascist friendly, or it's just unfair to do things like no platform in fascism races. So the attacks on Antifa, the attacks on anti-fascism are certainly more mainstream than they ever are before. But I look at Spain, look at the history of Spain, and when people were maligning anti-fascists, of course, you have to realize that the alternative to anti-fascism is what fought Europe's darkest ever hour. And I'd say now looking at Europe, now looking at our government in the United Kingdom, we have a government that uses the very language of the neo-Nazis and the fascists in Britain in 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s that would never have been mainstream. And now we have a government who is mired in corruption. And the only thing they can offer desperate people is to say, we're going to stop the boats. We're going to stop these boats. And another part of history, I don't wish to bore our Spanish friends. Britain has the fourth largest navy in the world. I'm sure the Spanish know that because we've had a few conflicts with each other over the centuries. We have the fourth largest navy in the world. France is 23 miles away from the UK coast. The might of the Nazi military couldn't invade Britain during the Second World War. And our government now describes as an invasion desperate people in boats arriving at this country. And that we have a government that holds up the poor and the desperate fleeing to come to this country as some kind of invaders on par with Nazis. That is the problem we have. So if people have got a problem with anti-fascists, just wait until you see what life would be like without anti-fascists, whether they're wearing black face masks or rainbow faces, or they even have pink hair or no hair. Without us, Europe would have been a very different place, and without us, there's a potential it could be an even worse place.
Han pasado muchos años desde que las bandas de skinheads nazis aterrorizaran a la gente, recuerdo los años 90, en las calles, en los estadios de fútbol. Sin embargo, muchos de aquellos mensajes hoy se escuchan en boca de políticos conservadores, incluso a veces de políticos socialdemócratas, laboristas, ¿no? ¿Las ideas de la extrema derecha están ganando hegemonía?
The reason we have no electoral far right in this country, they are literally, I think the largest vote they've got in the last 4 years was, in a by-election or a general election was around 2%. And the reason for that is, by and large, they've been discredited. And also because their language was taken into the mainstream during the Brexit debate and the Brexit arguments. The debates were so awful, so hurtful, and so damaging. As a country, Britain is still reeling from the things that were said during the Brexit debate. It was the most awful period. And these arguments and debates just stayed there. They've hung around like a bad smell. And yeah, I think it's fair. I think it's fair to say our prime ministers and our home secretaries since 2016 have realised that there's a percentage of people in this country who become very excited and very patriotic around the country's flags and borders. That's fine if that's what people do, but they won't let this go. They won't let this go. And while everything falls, I mean, if you've been to Britain since Brexit, you'll see the absolute mess we are in, where absolutely nothing is working. And while we want to address that and redress that, and we desperately need to, we have fruit not being picked, we have hospitals with no staff, we have no bus drivers, all these problems. And the clear answer is Brexit has failed. But like I said a moment ago, our government just keeps pointing at foreigners. That foreigners are the problem. And in fact, we need more foreigners. Recently in desperation, our government went back to Eastern and Central Europe and said, actually, we desperately need Polish workers back. And these people who'd made lives here, rented homes, sent their children to school, and then were sent back, have by and large told Britain, no, we're not coming back. We're not coming back because you hurt us. And so we have a shortage of skilled labor. We have a shortage of unskilled labor. The country's in a terrible state. But yeah, we have a government that realizes if you just keep pointing at foreigners, they can stay in power for as long as possible. And I think it's while they hold a percentage of people almost to ransom by the use of this language and the use of these ideas, that there is no scope electorally for the far right. But what we are seeing is, of course, the consequence of this language is that the far right in this country are as best organized as they have been for maybe 10, 12 years, but nowhere near as well organized and as well dangerous as they were in the mid-noughties, 2007, 2008. And that's because we have a government that have stolen all of their presentable policies. And some of the things the extreme far right believe, the electorate will not engage with that. So the government's caught in a trap, and the fascists and the neo-Nazis cannot find a way to sneak into the electorate, because the things that are more palatable our government's already saying. Look, we've always known Britain's a conservative right-wing country, but it's never been a fascist country.
Yeah,
we've never had fascists, but I would say we're increasingly close to just allowing our government to slip right in, because I think we're sleepwalking towards fascism with our eyes closed.
A veces da la sensación que estos grupos nazis más hardcore, más folclóricos, ¿no?, sirven para reducir a la extrema derecha a un puñado de fanáticos. Y muchos de los que los denuncian, luego, como hemos dicho, pues adoptan parte de esta retórica. Lo que pasa es que utilizan otros marcos, ¿no? Por ejemplo, hay una nueva extrema derecha que defiende los derechos LGTBI. Lo vemos en Alemania, lo vemos en Francia, lo vimos en el Reino Unido con la English Defence League, con las banderas LGTB. Lo vemos también con la defensa, en teoría, de los derechos de las mujeres, pero siempre estas defensas, tanto del colectivo LGTBI como de las mujeres, contra los que traerían el problema, que serían las personas migrantes, en concreto las musulmanas. ¿Cómo ha cambiado la extrema derecha en todos estos años?
That brings me right back to that point that I touched on earlier about why anti-fascists have to fill those vacuums where it seems very, very difficult to engage with difficult issues about some religious groups may hold homophobic views or difficult and challenging views. And the thing about the English Defence League, the EDL, was they would say, we're not racist. And of course they were, and there's plenty of instances that they were, but they weren't anti-racist. And then they would say they would stand up for women's rights. They're the real feminists. And when you ask them, what women's rights do you stand up for? What is your feminism? They would say, well, we believe a woman has a right to make pornography. A woman has a right to take her clothes off. And you'd say things like, well, what about equal and fair pay? What about women's reproductive rights? Well, yeah, not so keen on that. But again, yes, people did think, and I think for a lot of people who weren't necessarily and normally engaged in those kind of arguments or discussions or ideas, the EDL turn up and start talking about their perception of women's rights, and then suddenly, there's these drunk yobbos talking about going out to defend women's rights. Always men, of course, discussing women's rights and what women can do and can't do. And the thing about the English Defence League was, of course, that it was incredibly violent, and it attracted a section of our society who were football hooligan gangs, who were people. The EDL was very incestuous. It engaged in internecine violence against themselves, and it acted as a conduit because it wasn't neo-Nazi. There's people on the left who say, "Oh yeah, they're Nazis," but of course they weren't Nazis, but they were increasingly fascist, and that became a conduit. That what we saw in terror groups like National Action, in far-right parties like Britain First and Patriotic Alternative and the British Democratic Party, we saw people who came through the EDL from an organisation that didn't really even call for an end to immigration, didn't really even call for deportation of people who were non-white, but people who came through that and graduated because they radicalized. Again, the electoral far right in the UK was at its peak in 2010. It got 1 million votes in 2009. When the EDL burst onto the streets, really late 2009, 2010, as an organization that monitored the far right, we had absolutely no idea who any of these people were. The English Defence League were totally unknown to anti-fascists. The only people who knew who they were perhaps locals who would come forward and say, "Oh, I know that guy, he attends this football match, he's a football hooligan." They'd never appeared, even though the electoral far right was at its peak, and we'd never had far right political parties as big as they were in 2010. When the EDL came onto the scene, it was a whole new raft of people we'd never come into contact with, and they had tickled the underbelly of the white working class. And I saw Antifa Infoblatt, the German magazine. I forget what year it was, but it was the year when the AfD were taking off in Germany, and they characterized what was happening there the same as what was happening over here with the anti-Muslim movement. Angry white men.
Yeah.
Angry white men. And that's what they are. And again, I just keep coming back to it. So how do we as anti-fascists, we can stand at barriers and throw stuff at them, we can do all that kind of stuff. But actually, how do we get into communities so that there's fewer angry white men? How can we get into schools and colleges and workplaces so that, I like white men. I'm one myself. My father was a white man. But how can we have less angry white men? How can we have more helpful white men? And how can we have particularly happy white men? And that is a job of progressive people. I see it the conduit to that is through the trade unions and through community. And I see anti-fascism as giving people the tools and skills to address these issues, because the EDL terrified people.
Yeah.
And it terrified us as anti-fascists. And for a long, long time, we didn't know how to categorize it. We'd seen fascists and Nazis and neo-Nazis before. We didn't understand how the English. We knew why. We didn't understand how the English Defence League were so popular, and it was a social movement. Facebook, the whole thing exploded through Facebook,
Yeah.
and then we began to see this. This is how it works, and this is the biggest and greatest attack on civil society for a very long time. It was so destructive, so incredibly destructive, and again, a conduit to far greater extremism and terrorism, as we've seen since.
En la película hay un momento en el que las autoridades se muestran recelosas de vuestro trabajo, del trabajo de Hope Not Hate, de investigación, y tengo que decirte que en España nunca se ha juzgado a ningún neonazi por delitos relacionados con el terrorismo, a pesar de haber habido varias operaciones policiales en las que se les ha incautado armas e incluso planes para cometer atentados o incluso matar al presidente del gobierno, Pedro Sánchez. Recientemente fue desarticulada la sección española de Combat 18 en España, también con planes para cometer ataques y con armas. ¿Se valora la amenaza del terrorismo de extrema derecha actualmente a nivel global?
I think our security services have acted belatedly, and I think almost too harshly. But I don't want to get into that discussion just yet. The police were suspicious. I mean, the police wanted to put me in prison for, first of all, having someone who was active inside a banned organization, an organization which, by the way, the security services had told the Home Secretary that was definitely not working anymore. And partly this was a cultural thing. The police just said they're all white. They're just all white young men. So once they're banned, they'll do as they're told and go away. And I never believed they would. So I just kept going and going and going. And 2 days before the terror plot was uncovered, my boss went to one of these meetings where they invite concerned citizens and people with an interest in civil society, and he gets an invite. And some top police officer is asked, 7 months on from their banning, what are National Action up to? And the policeman says they're absolutely finished. Absolutely finished. And of course, they'd opened an office, a gym, a warehouse. They were holding training sessions, and we had someone in there. So then, when 2 days later we say, right, they're going to go and kill an MP, understandably, the police were embarrassed. And I also would not give up the name of my source inside National Action. So we went through then 2 years of hiding this person at great personal cost to me, I might say. And him, of course, we both suffered. But since then, it's fair to say the police have taken the threat of far-right terrorism far more seriously. I would also say, of course, at the time when National Action was initially banned, we had really high-level Islamic terrorism in the United Kingdom. We'd had bombs, we'd had people running around with machetes, stabbing people and trying to cut people up. So the traditional idea of the British Bobby was white people are not a problem. It's Muslims that are the problem, and we really, really struggled to get them to understand as well that you're no longer dealing with one of those 1 million people in 2009 who voted for a neo-Nazi party. You're dealing with an ideology that has changed, but they refused to see it. They refused to believe it. and they just thought it was more of that anti-immigration stuff. They refused to believe it was a real ideological movement. Similarly with Combat 18, C18, C18 was more of a criminal conspiracy. The people involved in C18 were older. More of them had already long-standing criminal records. They were already well known because they'd come through the traditional far right. And one of the things we're talking about Combat 18 that it's just come out in court here. I don't know if this has been picked up in Spain, but the person that runs Blood and Honor,
Yeah.
you know, was in court in the UK last week on terror charges, and he called to his defense a special branch, which is our secret police, a special branch officer, to corroborate that for the last 20 or so years, he's been given police information. And that is having ramifications because Blood and Honor and C18 here now are all very, very old men, very, very old and fat men. And it suddenly turns out they also raised hundreds of thousands of pounds for his defense. And there he is in court admitting that he'd been a police grass, he'd been passing information. So it's everything evolves and everything changes. The police were suspicious of us. The police were jealous of us. I understand in the walk-in, they couldn't, because they could have gone on for hours and hours and hours. But the police were embarrassed and humiliated. And since then, I think they've upped their game. But they made my life a living hell.
En España se ha denunciado a menudo la apología nazi fascista en los cuarteles militares. Incluso algunos oficiales del ejército español han firmado un manifiesto pidiendo casi un golpe de Estado. Ya se les descubrió en un chat hablando de que había que fusilar a todos los que votaban a la izquierda en España, ¿no? Sin embargo, incluso habiendo un gobierno progresista, no ha habido... que sepamos, muchos movimientos. También algunos agentes de policía han sido cazados en sitios con simbología nazi y fascista, dando charlas para grupos nazis y tienen sus perfiles en redes sociales abiertos donde difunden todo tipo de desinformación y fake news con motivaciones racistas y además alineadas directamente con el partido de extrema derecha, ¿no? ¿Pasa lo mismo en el Reino Unido?
Yes and no, certainly not to the extremes. When you were talking about the army, I was thinking of Franco, thinking the history repeats itself. I don't know what laws you have in Spain. Membership of a far-right organization is not allowed in the police force and is not allowed in the military. And we did see with National Action that there were serving soldiers who'd actually been to Afghanistan and Iraq who were members of National Action. We also have at the moment in this country really almost a crisis of confidence in the police, particularly the Metropolitan Police in London. A number of officers for sexual assault, racism, racist violence. I think there's something about those institutions, particularly the military, because you grow up a boy in England, and it's all about going out to kill, and our great military traditions, whether they're accurate or not. So there is an exceptional patriotism, but also we have a lot of Commonwealth soldiers. So British soldiers are also very much exposed to people and the history from the West Indies and Africa through the Commonwealth, through the Empire, who served and fought alongside. And we've made a real big effort to make sure the public are aware when we talk about our military history, the Second World War and so on, that actually, we had Muslim regiments, Sikh regiments, Hindu regiments, African regiments, who all came to this country in our hours of need in World War II. So there is a cautionary tale in that, but of course you get rotten individuals. But I don't think we have it at, dare I say, the levels that you have it in Spain. Because the one thing that even though we have an increasing problem with racism in this country, we also have this thing about fairness. So when we talk about asylum seekers and refugees, it's all about them jumping the queues and it not being fair. No, we don't have. I'm fairly certain, touch wood, people at the level of officers, commissioned officers planning assassinations, so on and so forth, in the military or the police. Unfortunately, we have a police force that tends to, its main issues tend to be a casual institutional racism and misogyny.
Yeah.
And we real problem with police officers overstepping the marks on those two things. But no, we're a very, 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 very long way from a military coup here. And again, I touch wood, but I don't know. Speak to me in 3 or 4 years. We don't. The way things are going, who knows? It might not even take 4 years. But no, quietly confident that those institutions, as troubling as they are, do tend to be focused on continually improving themselves, and they have a lot of improving to do. But no, I don't have fears of that. And you've made me very, very worried about Spain, to be honest.
¿Cómo surgió la idea de la serie? ¿Cómo ha sido recibida por el público una vez se ha estrenado?
Well, I've written 3 books: Hate, Nazi Terrorists, which was about the story that is the terrorism and terror trials, and then I wrote a book subsequently called The Walk-In. And if anybody in Spain wants to publish any of those books in Spanish, you're very welcome. Every time a book comes out, you get people coming to you and saying, I'm gonna take you to Hollywood, I'm gonna make you a millionaire. And eventually you just go, I know that's not going to happen, but you will pay me £1,000 for the film rights for 1 year. And with Nazi Terrorist, which is mainly what The Walk-In is based on, I just refused that. But I was very, very lucky. Jeff Pope, who is an Oscar-nominated screenwriter, he's done some fantastic films. He read it, he liked it, and he wanted to do it. And I said, yeah, okay. Didn't really think it was going to happen. And then we had lockdown. But basically, it was the determination of Jeff Pope and his team. He makes these real life stories. He, as well as his fiction work, which gets him to Hollywood, he does some fantastic stuff on British television on the BBC, ITV, Channel 4. And he said, I really, really want to do this. And for me, that was fine, sort of fine, but he had to convince my wife. So she likes a posh dinner as much as anyone, but we fell in love with him because he seemed like a good bloke, and it was very, very, very well received here. But the MP whose life I helped save, who was going to have her throat slit, she objected to the programme being made. And so the result is that it didn't get nominated for a Brit Award, and it's now you can't get it on demand on British television anymore. But it was loved. Everyone who saw it loved it, and every week it was on weekly, and you just go and read, as all megalomaniacs do. You go and read your own reviews, and you just read people's horror and excitement. And even my mum, after episode 4, she rang me up and said she desperately needed to know how it ended up. But anyway, it was really, really well received. Obviously, because Jack Renshaw, the baddie at the center of it, was an active paedophile. The far right were furious that their martyr was exposed as a paedophile. But I thought it was done brilliantly, and I'm really, really proud of it. The only thing is, of course, you're watching it dubbed into Spanish, and what has amused a lot of people is that Stephen Graham, who's a wonderful English actor who's very, very famous for his accents and can do my accent, because he was doing other stuff at the same time, he decided to play my character in his Liverpool accent. So people are always very, very, it's always saying pick up on that I don't have a Liverpool accent, I have a London accent. But other than that, what an honor for me.
Estamos en un momento en el que mucha de la gente que lleva trabajando contra el discurso de odio, contra la extrema derecha, se siente un poco preocupada por la expansión de estos discursos de odio, de esta normalización de la extrema derecha, sobre todo a través de las redes sociales e incluso con la adopción de algunos medios de comunicación de muchos marcos y mucho lenguaje de la extrema derecha. Sin embargo, surgen nuevas ideas y nuevas herramientas también para hacerles frente. Basado un poco en tu trabajo, en tu experiencia, haciendo un diagnóstico un poco de la actualidad y para terminar con un mensaje positivo, ¿cómo ves el panorama actual y cómo crees que podemos seguir combatiendo este odio?
Well, I think probably the way that Twitter X has become, without boundary, without taste, is really worrying. And so people are constantly saying, I'm leaving Twitter, I'm going to something new. My thing is, no, I'm staying here.
Me too.
Let's not let anti-intellectualism dominate. You know, the way that we have alternative truths and you can say what you want. We can't let that become the norm. We can't retreat. We can't retreat from that. We have to keep filling those spaces. We have to live in hope that, and it will happen. That's the way it happens. We keep getting second and third bites at this. Let's get it right. Let's get back into organizing. Let's get back into educating. Let's get back into standing up for decency. Let's get back into, and in fact, you know, almost like Hope Not Hate did, reintroduce the idea that people just think, oh, we're losing something. Well, did we ever really have control of it? Did we really have grip on it? Let's start going back to defending the rights of our friends, our neighbors, and people we haven't met yet, strangers. Let's not retreat. Social media is a problem. So let's fill it with our things, with our stuff. Let's fill it with happiness. Let's fill it with intelligence. Let's fill it with decency. I know how it feels. Sometimes I wake up and I look at the stuff on social media and I think, wow, why are people saying this? Why are people believing this? But I'll just go back in and I'll inject my little bit. It might be what song I'm listening to, it might be what I'm having for dinner, but I can infuse other people. I can meet these other people and I follow them on Twitter, people who are just dedicated every day to correcting a lie, to exposing a liar. If they come off that platform, the liars have it to themselves. And look, these people always devour themselves anyway. But we are not in retreat. No pasaran, right? We're not in retreat. Simple as that. Don't lose faith. That's all. You know, there will always be more of us than there are of them. That's why we mustn't hide. We mustn't be hiding from them.
Muchísimas gracias por tu mensaje esperanzador y para terminar esta entrevista, esperemos que la serie Walking sea un éxito, que todo el mundo la vea y también conozca el caso de Matthew Collins y la lucha que se lleva desde Hope Not Hate y desde muchas otras plataformas, organizaciones contra la extrema derecha a veces.